Let's pivot to our last theme for today. We wanted to bring on Jed Holtzman from RMI to talk to us about this big lever we're seeing in heat pump water heater market transformation, air quality districts that are phasing out combustion water heaters. So we wanted to get an update. We wanted to share it with our larger group because this is a really important movement that's happening. So Jed, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you. And if you want to take control of the screen, there should be a button right at the top that allows you to do so. Perfect.
Okay, great. Are you seeing everything in a normal fashion?
Yes, we are.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. Really great to speak to you all. My name is Jed Holtzman. I am on RMI's Carbon-Free Buildings team and really focused on, in the spirit of the Market Transformers branding that AWHI presented for Heat Pump Water Heater Day earlier. A regulatory movement, I guess I would say, that's developing that is the end result of which, in addition to reducing a lot of pollution and health impacts from pollution, going to sell a lot of heat pump water heaters. So I want to talk to you about that today. Um, so not seeing the text. Are you seeing the text on this slide?
No. Not yet.
Interesting.
Is it, does it build, Jed?
Nope, there is no animation on any of these slides. Seeing it on the
Let me
here we go. Got it. Okay. These two did have some. That was my mistake. So what we're dealing with mostly in this presentation is going to be California. I am going to talk some about the rest of the country, and I'm going to really blaze through this so we have time for some questions. But already adopted at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District and the South Coast Air Quality Management District, which these little polygons you're seeing are the air districts of the state of California. You have March 2023 and June of this year, zero emission water heating standards passed in these jurisdictions. And I'm going to go through a lot more about what those are, but you can see here just the scale that we're talking about. Just these two districts are 2/3 of California, over 9 million housing units and over 5.5 million homes using gas. These standards are going to specifically apply to gas units. And then the state of California is actually pursuing statewide zero emission standards on water heating as well. That is underway right now, and that rule is going to be likely to be adopted in 2025, coming online in 2026. We'll get to the CARB standards if we have time as well, but obviously the scale of the state of California is very large in terms of the number of units that we are potentially talking about changing out. Elsewhere in the country, we are seeing.
Does it go that quick for you?
Oh, I'm hearing some background noise. Elsewhere in the country, we're seeing exciting action as well. The U.S. Climate Alliance, which is a bipartisan group of governors making up 60% of the U.S. economy and over half of the U.S. population, committed at Climate Week late last year to quadruple heat pump installations. And part of that, 10 states listed here committed to join a cohort exploring the adoption of zero emission standards for space and water heating equipment, which I am, again, continue to hint at, but we'll talk more specifically about in just a minute. And this is over 41 million housing units. And then elsewhere, we are seeing, I guess, less specifically about standards, but more about heat pump acceleration. A group of 9 states and Washington, D.C. signed an MOU earlier this year under the auspices of the NESCOM nonprofit to have 65% zero emission water heating sales by 2030 and 90% by 2040. Again, more than 38 million housing units in these states. And so what this all adds up to is, a national picture with about 4 states signed up to this MOU to accelerate heat pumps. 4 states signed up to the cohort to examine zero emission standards, and then 6 states which are participating in both, and those are the ones with the hatch marks. And so when you think about the overlap states, these are states where we might look to see whether states are going to plan on using zero emission equipment standards to sort of meet these heat pump acceleration goals or as a tool to meet them. And to that effect, this is more than 1/3 of all the housing units in the country, of course, looking at the states that this is involving. To that end, the state of Maryland is actually, which you can see here, does have the hatch marks and is participating in both of these processes. The state of Maryland is moving forward on zero emission standards as well. They are proposing to have a rule on the street by the end of this year and adopted sometime next year. And that is a priority for the governor and something that the Department of the Environment has already started. So we're not just seeing action in California, but that is what I'm going to primarily talk about today. And so going to really run through a little more detail on the Bay Area AQMD's adopted rule, the South Coast AQMD's adopted and proposed rules, and then if we have time for it, get to what CARB is proposing as well. So first on the Bay Area, what we're looking at here is water heaters between 0 and 2 million BTUs per hour. That's what I'm going to be talking about throughout. As far as the California context, that is sort of what qualifies as residential and commercial, which these standards are residential and commercially focused. And so you can see here 3 different categories. Well, we're going to cut out furnaces for the purposes of AWHI. Obviously, these rules are covering space and water heating. But you can see a breakdown between 0 to 75,000, which we're typically calling residential, and then the bigger ones, which we're typically calling commercial. No, there's a little bit of overlap there. You're seeing lead time between the time that the rule was adopted in 2023 and the actual zero emission compliance dates. A really important sort of design element of these rules is to allow that lead time to set the market signal early and give a lot of time for market actors, OEMs, distributors, retailers, as well as policymakers and consumers to get ready for the transition and do both market development and development of complementary policies that may be necessary in order for the implementation to happen sort of in a smoother way or a more equitable way, whatever, you know, the jurisdiction may want to see, which in the Bay Area, of course, they do. Also seeing staggered implementation dates. So the sort of based on feasibility and market availability today and projected market availability, you're seeing, for example, the smaller tank size water heaters with a 2027 compliance date and the larger ones with a 2031 compliance date. What this compliance date effectively means is not that people are coming into the house to rip out the functioning equipment, but that when a newly sold piece of equipment is sold, distributed for sale, installed, etc., that piece of equipment would need to be zero NOx. That is the basis of this regulation. NOx pollution from these sources is quite significant. I do not have any slides on the sort of air quality and health impacts, not to mention the climate impacts of the combustion from these sources, but it is much more significant than one might imagine, usually coming in at a multiple of the pollution from power plants, depending on what jurisdiction you're looking at. So you're looking at zero NOx dates set in the future, staggered by market availability. That's basically the core concept that I'm going to be repeating over and over. And again, this applies to gas units. That is what the original rule that has been dialing NOx emissions down over time to low NOx and ultra low NOx has always covered and is now sort of turning that dial all the way down to 0. So different in nature, but not in kind to the kind of regulation that's already been going on since at least 1978 in the US. A couple interesting elements about the Bay Area rule. There's going to be sort of interim market reports on each of these tranches of equipment 2 years before the rules take effect. So for the 2027 water heater deadline that you're seeing, the market report is going to be this December. in preparation for 2025. And then it will move sort of into furnaces and then into the larger water heaters. There is an implementation working group process that's been set up. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Money for CBOs to participate in the process, consultant reports to fill in knowledge gaps. Talk more about that in a second. And I think worth noting, the Bay Area rules are leaving mobile home water heaters and pool water heaters at their 2007 emission limits and are not covering those sources.
Hey, Jed, quick question.
Sure.
Chris was asking if the gas included propane as well, or is it just natural gas?
Thank you so much for that, and apologies that I cannot both see the slides and the chat at the same time. No, this is pipeline gas, methane gas, natural gas, whatever you would like to call it. Propane is not covered by these rules. But very good question, and we'll make sure to highlight that when we get to the carb piece. This just gives you a quick look at the implementation working group, just to give you an idea of the sorts of folks that are in it. Everyone from local government, a couple OEMs that would participate, NGOs, program administrators, housing developers. It's a fairly broad base of folks. And again, that process for the residential water heater tranche just is winding down in preparation for that December checkpoint. And then the process will wind up for furnaces, which is the next tranche of equipment. These are just showing you some of the sort of consultant reports that the Air District contracted out to address, major issues of concern for the public. And I'm sure all of you, these are, there's no surprises here. These are the things that, folks always talk about in terms of the building equipment transition, in terms of impacts on tenants, grid impacts, permitting, costs, workforce, and the like. Many of those reports are published currently on the Bay Area Air District's Implementation Working Group website. Can definitely forward that to folks if you reach out to me after the presentation. But the rest will be coming later this month, we believe. So let's just quickly run through the South Coast rules. The South Coast AQMD, worth noting, covers 14 million people's air quality in Southern California. So it would be about the fourth largest state in the country by population if it were a state. Very important jurisdiction with obviously a lot of units in it. A rule was passed in June, and so I'm going to talk about that. You see here sort of 7 different equipment categories, and so much more sort of regimented and complicated than the Bay Area rules. But you do see the same 0 to 2 million BTU range broken down into different categories. Again, you see lead time. Again, you see staggered implementation dates with 29 through 33 depending. Just really quickly to break out here, in addition to the categories, the basic size categories that Bay Area was covering, South Coast is looking at breaking out sort of instantaneous water heaters separately, both small and large. They're looking at covering pool heaters, which Bay Area did not. And they are also breaking out high temperature units. So those that are meant to produce water greater than 180 degrees as a separate category that, needs more market and technology development and thus has a later compliance date. So a bit more thinking about sort of how to cascade the different categories in a more feasible fashion, according to the Air District's judgment. Again, only applying to gas. Something that is different at the South Coast is that they are having earlier compliance dates for new construction. So again, these rules only apply to newly sold equipment when equipment is replaced upon burnout or for a new project. And because of feasibility for new construction, cost for new construction, et cetera, they have judged that it is more feasible, and thus the compliance dates for all of those are moved up, with the earliest ones being as early as 2026 for new construction. And there's some alignment there with other state provisions that will be pushing the market in this direction as well. Another specific provision about the South Coast rules is that for large businesses. So not for homeowners with a tankless water heater, not for small businesses, but for large businesses, there is actually a useful life put on these pieces of equipment as well. Thus, the piece of equipment must be replaced with zero emission upon time of burnout or when this useful life elapses, whichever comes first. And so this is sort of a backstop rule to prevent sort of endless refurbishment of fossil devices in large businesses, and to ensure that over time, all of these units will eventually cycle over to zero emission. There's also a sort of exemptions, probably not the right word, but a hardship extension process or alternative compliance process to allow for flexibility in cases of, sizing, siting, electrical infrastructure, again, all of the challenges that you all are aware of and that may impact installations. And this is also paired with a rebate program, an in-house rebate program, which I will just show you quickly. Really quickly want to talk on, know we're running low on time. There's also remaining rules that are proposed. So this has already been passed, as was the Bay Area rule I talked about. This rule is proposed. This will cover the residential water heaters that were not covered here. So here you're basically seeing tankless, you're seeing higher BTU units, tankless and commercial largely. Here you're looking at the simple residential tank units, and you're seeing earlier compliance dates because, again, increased judgment of feasibility for transition, with the new construction dates, again, taking effect as early as 2026. All the same design elements here. Just want to highlight that this is proposed for adoption this December. This is a view of that in-house rebate program. Sorry, it's a little blurry. Just to get an idea of the sort of range of funding that's being proposed, money also going towards contractor training and application assistance as well. And this is a picture of sort of just the funding landscape for heat pump water heaters sort of writ large in the state. This is just a sample. You can see sort of an estimate of federal funding, an estimate of state funding, regional funding through the RENs, the Renewable Energy Networks, and then, of course, through your utility and or your community choice energy program, there would be different levels of incentive sort of depending on where in the state you live. So this is just to give sort of an example of the different funding sources that can be stacked. And then that South Coast rebate program I just presented will be sort of additional to that. I think for the purposes of time, going to have to cover CARB at a later time. Earlier in the process, a lot more left to do there, so I think there's plenty of time to cover that, but also happy to answer questions that folks have about it at the end. And let me just quickly say, I know people might be thinking about, well, I thought you couldn't sort of have things that just applied to gas because of the Berkeley decision and the new interpretation of EPCA. I just wanted to highlight, you all are probably aware, but again, these provisions, these regulations are emissions-based, source-specific regulations to reduce criteria pollutant emissions to achieve national ambient air quality standards under the Clean Air Act. And so sort of an entirely different bucket of law than the sort of code and EPCA conversation that we've all been having, and firmly protected in that regard. Also, these rules are fuel neutral. So if, for example, zero emission methane combustion units were invented, those would be covered. Those would be compliant with this rule. So thanks a lot for the time. Here's my email. Welcome you to reach out. And of course, happy to take any questions now if there's time for that. Thanks a lot.
There absolutely is. Yeah, thanks so much, Jed. Really appreciate that. Really great overview on this important development in the transition to zero NOx water heating equipment. So we can open that up for questions. One question came up initially from Jim Lutz. Jim, do you want to, and this might be a question for the entire group, including Jed, do you want to say your question that you asked earlier in the program on preparing for this? in the water heating world?
Well, basically, it was from the lessons that we've seen on programs other places. What are the key elements that these air quality management district programs should be focusing on to make sure that the product is there, the installers are trained, everybody knows the program, things are coming. You know, what's the best practice?
Jed, I think you're muted.
Thanks so much. I would certainly be interested in sort of the full group answer to that. I think I'd be very interested in a group discussion about that at a later time. I think for us, you know, first of all, there kind of are no firm answers. I think it's important to say that this is new. This is happening now. We are building the plane as we are flying it. I think the learnings from watching the implementation working group process in the Bay Area, one of the major takeaways I would say is that there's a need for intergovernmental collaboration to a degree that we really have never seen, and that there sort of needs to be built enduring connections between, in the California context, just for example, say air districts, CARB, the Housing and Community Development Department, you know, this California Public Utilities Commission, utilities, the Energy Commission. Everyone needs to collaborate together to make sure that this transition is smooth, timely, equitable. And I think, you know, obviously our government is instead designed into silos. And so I think trying to build those connections in a way that is not ad hoc, that is actually enduring and sort of has time-sensitive outcomes tied to it, seems to be sort of the first and most important piece of work, or rather a foundational piece of work from our perspective.
Thanks for that. That's great, Chad. I'm curious on your note. On the zero NOx combustion appliances, whether manufacturers think that's at all feasible. But Charles, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
CARB, South Coast IKMD, actively contacting utility programs to educate customers on this thing, and also the installers. So we have a robust communication going on as well. In California, we have tech and build programs, and more and more people are participating, but definitely we can do a lot more. And also I want to mention a couple of things. And the CARB, they're going out on various cities. They called it regional listening sessions on zero emission space and water heaters, and they are actively seeking community inputs. And what you have presented today was a very accurate reflection of what the CARB is doing in order to bring zero appliances the emission standard in California. So they are actively engaging. So we can do a lot more, but the momentum is there. It is building up.
Well, then maybe that. Thanks for that, Charles. Appreciate that. And I know we're at time. Maybe a final closing question, Jed, is speaking of that momentum and speaking of Maryland with the executive order and NESCOM's draft rules. What's your crystal ball look like? Is this a snowball effect where air quality across the United States really moves in this direction? Things, yeah. What do you think?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think the degree to which it is a ball being pushed horizontally through thick snow versus a ball rolling downhill is influenced by the people on this call. And I think, you know, having every part of the chain, the supply chain that was presented earlier, every market actor from the OEM to the consumer moving in concert is going to be sort of the degree to which they're moving in concert will be proportional to the degree to which that ball is rolling downhill, to make a clunky metaphor. So I think what we're going to see is California moving wholeheartedly in this direction. We see the NESCOM participating states on that map really heavily exploring this. So I think over the next few years, my prediction is that California and Maryland will not be the only jurisdictions to pass these rules, these sorts of policies. And that, you saw from the statistics earlier, the number of housing units that we are talking about, not to mention commercial buildings, and thus the number of heat pump water heaters that will be being sold is going to increase really substantially, starting in 2026, if not earlier. I mean, that is pretty much set in stone at this point. So wanted to make sure that folks got the good news.
Good news and the challenging news. We got to make sure we can get these units out there in a positive way, but it's a good problem to have. Well, thanks, Jed. Thanks for that. Great overview. Really appreciate it. Thanks to everybody for joining our call. We'll send out slides and recording shortly. And yeah, hit us up with any questions or comments. And look forward to seeing you at one of our future working groups. Thanks to everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.